So in this talk I'd like to introduce Søren Kierkegaard's fictional philosopher, Johannes Climacus, and I'll concentrate here on his critique of rational theology. First, let's set the scene a bit in terms of how this character, Johannes Climacus, how he fits into Kierkegaard's overall project as an author. Well, Kierkegaard's work was shaped in general by his perception of modern culture as tending toward a kind of forgetfulness. He had in mind a rather particular sort of forgetfulness, not the sort when you might forget someone's name, or your keys, but rather a kind of forgetfulness of what it means to be human. He discerned this tendency at work in modern philosophy, especially in Enlightenment thought and in the tradition of post-Kantian German idealism. In particular, he associates this kind of forgetfulness with the claims of modern philosophers to attain to a purely impersonal, objective point of view on the whole of reality. But he perceived this kind of forgetfulness at work also in modern forms of ethical and religious life. Kierkegaard felt that Christianity in particular had lost its grip on people as a way of life, while persisting in a shallow form. Christianity had become institutionalized, merely notional, conformist. And this is what he famously called the monstrous illusion of Christendom. He suspected that folk were taking themselves to be Christians, while in truth relating to the world and to their own lives in ways that could not truly count as religious at all, let alone as distinctively Christian. Broadly speaking, Kierkegaard's writings seek to counteract this tendency within European modernity, a tendency he sometimes also called the objective tendency. And central to this project is the aim to raise anew the question of what it means to be Christian. More widely, to reawaken the existential power of ethical and religious language. So in his journals, for example, Kierkegaard uses a fairy tale image in which the old Christian dogmatic terminology is like an enchanted castle, where the most beautiful princes and princesses rest in a deep sleep, but which needs only to be awakened, brought to life, in order to stand in its full glory. So Kierkegaard developed a theory and practice of what he called indirect communication. This theory and practice incorporates his understanding of Socrates and of the so-called maieutic method of teaching. That is, the way of teaching that Socrates described in Plato's Theaetetus with the metaphor of a midwife, where Socrates describes himself as one who does not himself give birth to knowledge or wisdom, but who helps others to, as it were, to give birth for themselves. This is reflected in many distinctive features of Kierkegaard's texts. His texts are often fragmentary, they're often funny, lyrical, rich in examples, intimate in tone. They draw widely from ancient philosophy and the classics, as well as from biblical and Christian sources. In general, they're more concerned to articulate difficulties than to proffer easy solutions. Perhaps most strikingly of all, they make use of a whole panoply of fictional authors, Kierkegaard's so-called pseudonyms, who are designed to represent different points of view, not just as abstract views or opinions, but as variously situated perspectives. Who then is Johannes Climacus? Well, he's the fictional author of two books, Philosophical Crumbs and Concluding Unscientific Postscript. Philosophical Crumbs was published in 1844, and it's sometimes translated into English as Philosophical Fragments. His name, Johannes Climacus, John of the Ladder, is based on a real-life 6th century Sinai monk who wrote a ladder of divine ascent. Kierkegaard's Climacus is a self-described humorist. He associates humour with an eye for comical incongruences. He also associates humour with a certain overall perspective on human life, as comically inconsequential, all sound and fury. Well, in Concluding Unscientific Postscript, that's Climacus's lengthy postscript to his short little book called Crumbs, Climacus tells two different stories about why he became an author. Both these stories place him in a garden on a bench. In the first story, he's sitting outside a cafe in Frederiksberg Garden, smoking a cigar in his usual attitude of thinking and loafing, as he puts it. Musing on all the industry and innovation of modern life, he wonders what there could be left to do for a loafer like himself. Well, he hits upon the idea that while everybody else is busying about making life easier, the one thing left for him to do is to make life more difficult. His second autobiographical vignette places Johannes at a graveside. Contemplating the stillness of the evening and the silence of the dead, Climacus rests on a bench. Hidden from view, he overhears an old man lamenting to his grandson about his recently deceased son, the grandson's father. What troubles the old man, above all, is the way his son had let himself be cheated out of his Christian faith by the promise of a novel kind of philosophical wisdom, a kind of wisdom that would fly beyond faith. Well, the grandfather's words strike a chord with Climacus, who finds himself deeply moved, and he decides he must therefore get to the bottom of this misunderstanding between modern speculative philosophy and Christianity. Altogether, these two stories offer important clues about Climacus's overall aims as an author and why his approach is at once humorous and deadly serious. We could summarise his general aim in this way: to show how Christianity resists being interpreted, in the mode of modern Christian speculation, as a kind of philosophical theory, apt for disinterested contemplation. Part of this, in Philosophical Crumbs, includes a critique of rational theology, i.e. any attempt to prove the existence of God. Climacus develops the following line of argument: since there can be no deduction of the existence of anything, there can be no deduction of the existence of God. On this basis, Climacus presents a dilemma for the rational theologian. Either there is no God, in which case it goes without saying that there can be no proof of his existence, or if there is a God, that this is so could never be merely inferred through a process of abstract reasoning. Either way, if rational theology is the project of trying, through abstract reasoning, to deduce God's existence, the whole endeavour is a non-starter. Climacus's argument relies on the premise that processes of reasoning are never to the conclusion that something exists, but instead can only proceed from the assumption that something exists. He gives the example of a court considering evidence in a criminal case. No such evidence could prove that a criminal exists, he points out. Instead, what the evidence might show is that such and such a person who is taken to exist is a criminal. So his point is not to deny that there can be better or worse evidence for the existence of things. Rather, his point is that exercises of belief or faith, in Danish there's just one word, tro, belief or faith, that is, exercises of the capacity to take things to exist, these are not based on inferences. In the course of his discussion, Climacus develops a contrast between two types of faith or belief, tro. There's faith or belief in the ordinary sense and faith or belief in the eminent sense. So faith in the ordinary sense consists in ordinary takings to exist on the basis of sensory perception in space and time, where taking something to exist means taking it to be subject to processes of generation and destruction. But then there's faith or belief in the eminent sense, which is faith in God's eternal reality, prior to and independently of the temporal flux. Climacus holds that rational theology not only involves a confused attempt to posit the existence of something, namely God, as a logical inference, but it also runs a risk of conflating ordinary takings to exist on the basis of sense perception with distinctly religious forms of faith. Climacus further associates ordinary belief or faith with wonder and wonder with philosophy. Philosophy begins not, as in modern philosophy since Descartes, in a stance of universal doubt. Instead, as the ancient philosophers already thought, philosophy begins in the pathos of wonder, at the very existence of that which we do indeed take to exist. From these points, Climacus draws the implication that putative proofs of God's existence cannot but presuppose what they are setting out to prove. Take, for example, the case of the so-called design argument, roughly the thought that the order and purposiveness of the natural world can only be explained by positing the existence of a divine designer. Climacus insists that any attempt to infer God's existence from the order and beauty of the natural world must already presuppose an observation-independent, faith-guided interpretation of nature as the work of a divine creator, seeing nature, so to speak, as charged with God's grandeur. Now, one might complain at this point that Climacus relies on an unduly narrow view of the aims of rational theology, for there's a venerable tradition in which rational theology is not really about trying to deduce God's existence from some supposedly neutral standpoint, but instead rational theology seeks to articulate and elucidate the perspective of religious faith. In Augustine's classic formulation, the task properly understood is faith seeking understanding. In fact, Climacus does allow that arguments for the existence of God could have a positive function for the believer if these arguments are seen not as proper proofs, but instead as ways of articulating the perspective of faith, i.e. faith in the eminent sense, faith in God. But he insists that even then, God's existence can only emerge, for a person who's trying to prove it, if they surrender to the perspective of faith and let go of any stance of disinterested contemplation. It's here that Climacus introduces his famous notion of a leap to describe the movement in which the theologian who's trying to prove God's existence lets go and surrenders to the religious perspective that has been guiding their reasoning all along. We should note here that Climacus makes no suggestion that the possibility of the leap somehow justifies or warrants belief in God, nor is there any suggestion of a mere decision to affirm God's existence irrationally and by sheer force of will from an initial position of neutrality or skepticism. That's contrary to a persistent misrepresentation of Kierkegaard's thought. Instead, the image of a leap is being used to symbolize a kind of activity that's also a kind of passivity. On the one hand, leaping is something one does. As Climacus puts it, it's meine Zutat, my contribution. The relevant contrast here is with anything that could be attributed to a proof itself or to any impersonal process of reasoning. In the final analysis, Climacus wants to remind us, judgments are made not by abstract arguments, but by existing thinkers. On the other hand, the activity of leaping is apt also to signify a kind of letting go, as when one allows oneself to jump a ditch without being sure of making it. The contrast here is with attitudes of holding on, in which one refuses to relinquish control, for example by not allowing oneself to leap, or dance, say, or take the plunge. In this regard, Climacus's point is that thoughtful responsiveness to reality requires allowing one's judgments to reach beyond the deliverances both of sense perception and abstract reason. Now, Climacus's discussion no doubt has some point of contact with other philosophers, and especially with the critique of rational theology in Kant's First Critique. But we should notice the distinctive emphasis in Climacus's approach on the performative dimensions of rational theology, considered as a concrete human practice. His focus is on the question, how is the person who's trying to prove the existence of God actually related to what they're trying to do? Finally, however, let me say a little about the wider context of Climacus's discussion of arguments for the existence of God. In Philosophical Crumbs, Climacus's critique of rational theology is embedded in a chapter entitled The Absolute Paradox, a Metaphysical Caprice. His starting point is that human thought is moved by a passion to understand that which presents itself as an obstacle to being understood. This passion impels thought forward as it overcomes anomalies and finds new ways of making sense of things, pushing back frontiers of knowledge and understanding. Under this aspect, human thought strives to bring things into its orbit by making sense of them. It strives to assimilate, to make its own. On the other hand, Climacus supposes that in this very dynamic of pushing back frontiers, human thought is driven also by a will to transcend itself. Human thought wants to discover something radically beyond itself, something absolutely other. Under this aspect, human thought harbours within itself a kind of death wish. As Climacus puts it, thought seeks its own annihilation. even if we accept this much, it does not follow that thought's death wish could ever be fulfilled. Perhaps, as Hegel maintained, the real is the rational, and reality simply contains nothing that thought cannot ultimately make its own. Climacus's metaphysical caprice, however, involves trying to find something that really does satisfy the condition, something that human thought cannot think. Well, Climacus's discussion has many twists and turns, but two key paradoxes emerge as candidates for what might satisfy this condition. First is what we might call the paradox of divine alterity, simply the thought of God as absolutely other, as that which cannot be grasped in thought. There's a second paradox, which we might call the paradox of self-attributed untruth, which is the thought of oneself as human as in a condition of unqualified spiritual darkness or untruth. Regarding the first paradox, the one about divine